August 14th, 2006, Greystone County, western Kansas. The first truck arrived just after sunrise, trailing dust across the dry road behind Walter Boone's farm. By noon, there were 11 more lined up beside his fence, each carrying the same thing: dead irrigation pumps nobody wanted anymore. Men climbed from their trucks laughing as they shoved rusted machines into the weeds beside Walter's property. Old diesel housings, bent shafts, cracked cast iron. Some still carried faded company logos from the 70s. Others looked like they had already died twice before reaching his land. Walter stood near the fence with both hands inside the pockets of his worn brown coat, saying almost nothing. That was what people remembered most about him. He never argued, never defended himself, never explained why he kept taking broken pumps year after year. One farmer spat tobacco into the dirt and shouted, "Walter's building himself the ugliest museum in Kansas." The others laughed. Then a polished black pickup rolled in behind the line of trucks, cleaner than anything else on that road. Randall Pierce stepped out wearing pressed jeans, polished boots, and sunglasses that cost more than most men's weekly fuel bills. Randall owned Pierce Water Systems, the largest irrigation equipment dealership in 3 counties. He sold modern electric pumping systems with digital pressure monitors and automatic controls. Around Greystone, people listened when Randall talked, because Randall had money, and Randall loved humiliating Walter Boone. "Well," Randall said loudly, looking over the piles of rust beside the fence, "looks like the graveyard's getting crowded again." More laughter rolled through the crowd. One of Randall's mechanics kicked an old diesel pump off a trailer so hard it slammed into the dirt only a few feet from Walter's boots. The mechanic smirked. "Careful, Walter. That one might be too modern for you." Even the younger men laughed at that. But Walter never raised his voice. He simply bent down beside the machine, wiped 2 fingers through the dirt on the cracked housing, and stared at the old engine plate for several quiet seconds, like he recognized. Like he knew something nobody else did. And what happened later would make half that county remember this moment for the rest of their lives. Because this story was never really about broken pumps. It was about a man who understood something the rest of the world had forgotten. By 2010, people around Greystone County had stopped calling Walter Boone by his real name. Most simply called him the junk farmer. Children slowed their bicycles when passing his property, just to stare at the endless rows of dead machinery stacked behind the fence. Old pumps, water housings, engines, pipes, iron parts covered in prairie dust and dead grass. From a distance, the place looked less like a farm and more like the remains of some forgotten industrial war. People joked about it constantly. At Miller's Diner in town, farmers sitting around the breakfast counter would laugh and say things like, "If civilization ends, Walter Boone will still be there, collecting broken junk." Nobody laughed louder than Randall Pierce. Randall had become rich convincing farmers to replace their old diesel systems with expensive electronic pump units imported from Colorado. His company sponsored county fairs, baseball teams, even church fundraisers. He carried himself like a man who believed the future belonged to him. And maybe it did, at least for a while. One morning in March of 2013, Randall stood in the middle of Miller's Diner, talking to a group of younger farmers. "New era of irrigation. You know why guys like Walter stay poor?" Randall asked, stirring cream into his coffee. "Because they think old steel matters more than progress." Several men nodded. A young irrigation engineer visiting from Wichita chuckled and added, "Walter Boone's basically living in 1954. The diner erupted with laughter. Walter himself was sitting only 2 stools away. He never reacted. He just kept eating his eggs slowly while the men laughed around him. Then Randall leaned back and said loud enough for the whole diner to hear, "Truth is, some people are too stubborn to realize the world moved on without them." That time, even the waitress laughed. Walter finished his coffee in silence, folded $1 beneath the cup, and walked out into the cold Kansas wind without saying a word. But there was something nobody in that diner understood. Walter Boone had never been collecting those pumps because he thought they still worked, and he had never kept them because he feared change. The real reason went back more than 50 years, to the driest summer western Kansas had ever seen. Walter was 11 years old during the drought of 1954. Back then, his father, Elias Boone repaired irrigation pumps for struggling wheat farmers across Greystone County. Elias was not an educated man in the way bankers or engineers talked about education. He never wore a tie, never owned a new truck, never traveled farther east than Wichita. But when pumps failed in the middle of July, people prayed for Elias Boone to arrive. Walter still remembered the smell of those nights: hot diesel, burned oil, dry dirt cooling beneath moonlight. Sometimes Elias would wake him long after midnight and say, "Get your boots on. Somebody's crop is dying." Then they would drive across endless dark fields while wheat rustled under the wind like waves on black water. Walter loved those drives more than anything in his childhood. His father rarely spoke much, but when he did, every sentence sounded important. One night they reached a failing irrigation rig belonging to a farmer named Harold Bennett. The pump had overheated twice already, and Bennett stood beside the field, looking close to tears, because his corn was beginning to curl from heat. Walter watched his father kneel beside the machine with a flashlight between his teeth. Elias touched the engine housing for several seconds before saying quietly, "She ain't dead. She's misunderstood." Walter never forgot that sentence. Hours later, the pump roared back to life. Water sprayed across the field beneath the moonlight, while Bennett nearly cried with relief. On the drive home, Elias rested one arm out the truck window and finally told Walter something that shaped the rest of his life. "Machines are like people," he said. "Most folks quit on them too early. That was only part of it." Because Elias Boone carried another belief almost nobody else shared. He believed the old diesel pumps built during the 50s, 60s, and early 70s were stronger than anything being manufactured now. Not prettier, not quieter, not smarter, stronger. Their housings were heavier cast iron. Their shafts were thicker steel. Their torque tolerances were built for punishment instead of efficiency. Modern companies built machines to save fuel and impress investors. But old builders had designed machines to survive droughts. Walter learned to hear bearing wear through engine vibration before he was 16. He learned how overheated diesel smelled different from burnt hydraulic fluid. He learned how certain pumps could still survive after everyone believed they were finished. But there was one thing Elias taught him that mattered more than all the others. People throw away what they no longer understand. His father once said while rebuilding a cracked impeller in their barn. That's why smart men sometimes look foolish before hard times arrive. Walter did not fully understand those words as a boy. Not until many years later. Not until the line of broken pumps beside his fence stretched farther than anyone thought possible. And not until an entire county discovered that Walter Boone had been quietly preparing for something long before anyone else saw it coming. The summer of 2021 arrived like a punishment across western Kansas. By June, the ponds outside Greystone County had already begun shrinking into cracked bowls of mud. Windmills slowed, creeks disappeared. Dust drifted across the roads in pale brown clouds that hung in the evening light like smoke after a fire. Old farmers started using a phrase Walter Boone had not heard since childhood: "The ground's getting thirsty." At first, nobody panicked. Men trusted the new systems Randall Pierce had sold them. Expensive electric pumps with digital monitoring screens and automated pressure balancing. Randall's advertisements promised greater efficiency, deeper pull capacity, and future-proof irrigation performance. That phrase was printed on every brochure. Future-proof. But by July, the water table had fallen lower than expected, then lower still. The new systems began straining under loads they had never truly been built to handle. Electronic sensors overheated in triple-digit temperatures. Automatic shut-off systems triggered constantly. Circuit boards failed beneath endless operating hours. Farmers who had borrowed money for those systems now watched their cornfields curl beneath the heat. Randall kept insisting the answer was simple: upgrade the units, add auxiliary cooling, install deeper draw packages. Every solution cost more money, and every week the drought grew worse. But what happened next was the part nobody forgot. One evening near the end of July, a farmer named Clyde Mercer lost pressure across his entire north irrigation line. His electronic system failed less than 3 weeks before harvest season. Clyde spent 2 desperate days waiting for replacement parts that never arrived. By the third morning, Sections of his corn already looked sick, leaves folded inward, soil cracking beneath the roots. Clyde drove into town exhausted and furious, hoping Randall Pierce could somehow fix it faster. Instead, Randall simply handed him another financing form. "You want reliable water," Randall said. "That's what reliable costs." Clyde stared at the paperwork for a long time. Then he left without signing. That afternoon, people saw something strange outside Walter Boone's property. Clyde Mercer was loading one of Walter's old diesel pumps onto a trailer. The machine looked terrible. Its paint had almost completely burned away years earlier. The exhaust pipe leaned sideways. Oil stains covered half the housing. The engine itself looked older than some of the barns in Greystone County. Two teenagers driving past actually laughed out loud watching Clyde chain it down. One of them shouted, "Might as well water your crops with a horse." But Clyde ignored them, because desperate men stop caring about embarrassment. Walter helped secure the pump without saying much. Then, just before Clyde drove away, Walter rested one hand on the old steel housing and quietly said something almost nobody heard. "Don't shut her down once she starts pulling." That night, the old pump fired alive beneath Clyde Mercer's irrigation rig. The engine coughed hard enough to shake the entire trailer frame before settling into a deep, violent rhythm that echoed across the fields. Black smoke rolled briefly into the night sky. Several neighbors stood watching from nearby roads, expecting the machine to explode within minutes. Instead, water began surging through the line, not smoothly, not quietly, but steadily. Hours passed, then midnight, then dawn. The old diesel pump kept running, 19 straight hours beneath crushing load. And by sunrise, Clyde's field was alive again. Word spread faster than wildfire across Greystone County. Men who had mocked Walter Boone for 15 years suddenly started driving slower past his fence. And for the first time in decades, people began staring at those mountains of old pumps differently. Because buried beneath the rust and weeds was a question nobody could ignore anymore. What if Walter Boone had been right all along? But there was still something far bigger nobody knew. Walter had never been collecting broken pumps for scrap metal. Not once. Every machine that crossed his fence had been studied, cataloged, remembered. Most evenings after sunset, Walter worked alone inside the long tin barn behind his farmhouse. Few people had ever seen the inside of it. The place smelled of grease, welding smoke, old paper, and iron dust baked by Kansas heat. Rows of shelves lined the walls. Injector housings, pressure valves, drive shafts, impellers, bearings wrapped carefully in oilcloth. Each part carried handwritten notes attached with faded masking tape. 1964. Strong housing, weak seals. 1971 Oklahoma casting excellent under deep draw. 1968 triple bearing shaft rare steel mix. Walter remembered nearly every machine ever dropped at his fence. Not because he was sentimental, because he understood them. He knew which manufacturers began cutting material costs after the fuel crisis of the 70s. He knew which pump lines secretly switched to weaker imported alloys during the 80s. He knew which cast iron housings could survive extreme vibration and which cracked beneath stress. And hidden beneath a tarp in the farthest corner of the barn sat something nobody in Greystone County knew existed. A prototype deep-draw diesel pump built in 1971 by Prairie Hydraulics. Only 3 had ever been made. The company abandoned the project after oil prices climbed and efficiency regulations tightened. The pumps were considered too heavy, too fuel-hungry, too expensive for the future companies believed was coming. But Walter's father had once helped test one, and before Elias Boone died, he managed to keep one hidden away. Walter still remembered the final thing his father ever told him about that machine. One day, Elias whispered from his hospital bed in 1989, "People are gonna confuse efficiency with strength." At the time, Walter barely understood what he meant. Now he did. Modern systems were designed for ideal conditions, maximum profit, minimum fuel. But drought did not care about ideal conditions, and neither did the earth beneath Kansas. By September, the county looked different. Cornfields browned early. Bankers started making quiet visits to struggling farms. Men stopped talking confidently at the diner, and something even stranger began happening at Walter Boone's fence. The line returned, but this time, Nobody came to dump machines. Now they came asking for them back. Old farmers stood silently beside pumps they themselves had abandoned years earlier. Some still carried dents from when they had been thrown off trailers in front of Walter's property. The same men who once laughed at him now removed their hats before speaking. Walter never mocked them, never reminded them what they had said. He simply asked one question: "What are you trying to save?" If the answer was family land, dying crops, or surviving harvests, Walter helped them. Sometimes he rebuilt entire systems through the night for almost no profit. But if someone intended to flip the machines for money after the drought passed, Walter refused. That part made Randall Pierce furious. Every pump Walter restored meant one less desperate farmer buying expensive replacements from Pierce Water Systems. Randall's sales collapsed almost overnight. Inventory piled up in his warehouses, while old diesel pumps across the county growled back to life. Randall began attacking Walter publicly, at church gatherings, at auctions, at town meetings. This county's moving backward. Randall snapped one evening during a local agriculture board discussion. Walter Boone's selling nostalgia to desperate people. Several businessmen nodded nervously, but not the farmers, not anymore, because many of them had already seen something Randall had not. The old machines kept running. Then Randall made the mistake that destroyed him. One Friday afternoon, cameras from a Wichita television station arrived in Greystone County to cover the drought crisis. Randall saw his opportunity immediately, standing beside one of his polished modern irrigation systems. He looked directly into the camera and said, "If Walter Boone's junkyard pumps are truly better than modern equipment, then let's prove it publicly." People nearby fell silent. Randall smiled coldly. "Bring one of those old diesel relics to the Greystone water trials next month. We'll see how long it survives beside real technology." The challenge spread across the county by nightfall, and deep down, almost everyone believed Randall Pierce had finally cornered Walter Boone in public, because this was no longer about rumors beside a fence. Now the entire county was going to watch one old man defend 15 years of humiliation in front of everyone who had ever laughed at him. October 17th, 2021. The morning of the Greystone water trials arrived cold and strangely quiet. By sunrise, pickup trucks already lined both sides of the county fairgrounds. Farmers stood in groups beneath pale gray skies, drinking coffee from thermoses while talking in low voices about water levels, failed harvests, and whether Walter Boone was finally about to embarrass himself in front of the entire county, or embarrass everyone else. Nobody seemed certain anymore. At the center of the fairgrounds, Randall Pierce's equipment sat beneath bright floodlights and television cameras, like a machine built for war. Stainless steel housings gleamed beneath the morning sun. Thick digital control panels blinked constantly with pressure readings and temperature data. Randall had even parked 2 brand-new support trucks nearby with his company logo painted across the sides in enormous blue letters. Pierce Water Systems, the future of American irrigation. Randall moved through the crowd and shaking hands confidently, smiling for cameras, laughing loudly whenever reporters approached him. Walter Boone arrived almost 40 minutes late, and unlike Randall, he came alone. His truck was an old faded Ford with rust along the wheel wells. Behind it rattled a flatbed trailer, carrying one weather-beaten diesel pump covered beneath a stained canvas tarp. Some people laughed the moment they saw it. Others just stared. Walter parked near the edge of the field without saying much to anyone. He stepped slowly from the truck, removed the tarp, and revealed the old Prairie Hydraulics prototype beneath years of dust and repaired steel. The machine looked ancient. Heavy cast iron housing, thick manual valves, massive torque shaft, hand-welded reinforcement seams. Nothing about it looked modern. A young engineer standing beside Randall actually smirked and whispered, "That thing belongs in a museum." Even some of the older farmers shifted nervously, because for the first time, many wondered whether Walter had made a mistake accepting the challenge. Then Randall walked over, smiling. "Well, Walter," he said loudly enough for nearby cameras to hear, "I appreciate you bringing entertainment." A few people chuckled. Randall tapped the old diesel housing with his knuckles. "You know this isn't about nostalgia anymore, right? These farmers need real solutions." Walter looked at him. for several quiet seconds before answering. "She'll pull." That was all he said. Randall laughed openly. Then the contest began. The challenge itself was brutal. Both systems would attempt to draw water continuously from an emergency deep well drilled farther below the county's normal irrigation range. Engineers monitoring the trial warned beforehand that the pressure load would exceed standard operating conditions for most agricultural systems, which was exactly why Randall had chosen it. At first, his modern system performed beautifully. Water surged upward through the clear testing pipe with impressive force. Pressure numbers flashed across the digital monitors, while television reporters nodded approvingly nearby. Randall folded his arms proudly. The crowd clapped. Several people glanced toward Walter Boone, with expressions that almost looked pitying. Then 11 minutes passed, and the warning alarms began. At first, it was only one sharp electronic tone, then another. Temperature readings climbed suddenly. Pressure fluctuations appeared across the monitors. Cooling systems activated at maximum speed. Randall's smile faded. One of his engineers hurried toward the control panel, while muttering something under his breath. The pump strained harder. Water flow became uneven. Then, with one violent metallic shudder, the entire system shut itself down automatically to prevent catastrophic failure. The fairgrounds fell silent. Nobody moved. Steam drifted upward from Randall's equipment, while his crew scrambled around the machine in panic. And somewhere in the silence, people heard something else. Walter Boone's boots walking slowly across the dirt. He climbed onto the old prairie pump without hurry. No speech, no performance, no attempt to humiliate anyone. He simply adjusted the fuel valve, checked one pressure fitting by hand, and wrapped his fingers around the starter lever. Then he pulled. The old diesel engine exploded awake like thunder. The sound rolled across the fairgrounds so violently, several children covered their ears. Thick black smoke burst from the exhaust pipe before disappearing into the cold Kansas wind. The entire machine shook hard against the trailer frame. Some people actually laughed again, but Walter never looked up. He listened to the engine, the same way his father once had, beneath moonlit fields half a century earlier. Then the water began to rise, slowly at first, heavy, steady, relentless. The old diesel pump groaned beneath crushing load, while deep vibrations rolled through the ground itself. No digital displays, no blinking screens, no automated systems, only iron, torque, pressure, and a machine built during an era when survival mattered more than efficiency. 10 minutes passed. Then 20. Water kept flowing. At 35 minutes, Randall's crew had still failed to restart their system. At 42 minutes, the old prairie pump was still pulling water from depths modern systems could barely survive. And that was the moment everything changed, because the crowd finally understood what Walter Boone had known for 15 years. He had never been collecting junk. He had been collecting strength. A silence settled over the fairgrounds, unlike anything Greystone County had ever seen. Farmers who once mocked Walter now stared at the old diesel machine like they were witnessing something almost impossible. Some removed their hats quietly. Others simply looked ashamed. Randall Pierce stood frozen beside his dead system, unable to speak while television cameras captured every second. But what happened next became the part people remembered most. Walter Boone shut the old pump down himself after nearly an hour under load. The engine rattled to silence beneath drifting smoke and cold autumn wind. Then Walter climbed down from the trailer and walked directly toward Randall Pierce. Most people expected revenge, expected humiliation, expected Walter to finally return 15 years of mockery in front of the entire county. Instead, Walter stopped only a few feet away and said quietly, "Your systems weren't built for this kind of drought." Randall stared at him without answering. Walter continued, "That doesn't make you stupid." The crowd remained completely silent. "It just means hard years came back before anybody expected them to." Randall looked away first, and somehow, that hurt worse than if Walter had screamed at him. Within months, Pierce water systems began collapsing financially. Farmers canceled equipment contracts. Banks tightened lending. Expensive electronic systems sat unsold in storage yards, while demand for old diesel pumps exploded across western Kansas. Meanwhile, Walter Boone's property changed completely. The place once mocked as the pump graveyard slowly became known as Boone Yard. Farmers traveled from Oklahoma, Nebraska, even parts of Texas, hoping Walter could restore forgotten machines buried behind barns or abandoned in fields decades earlier. But Walter refused to turn the drought into a business empire. That surprised people most of all. He charged fair prices, sometimes almost nothing. Widows received repairs for free. Struggling family farms paid in installments. Young farmers willing to learn often left with rebuilt pumps and handwritten notes Walter tucked into their toolboxes. People started bringing their sons to meet him, not because Walter Boone was famous, because fathers wanted their boys to see what quiet wisdom looked like. Randall Pierce disappeared from public life after the winter of 2022. His main dealership closed before Christmas beneath mounting debt and legal pressure from failed financing agreements. Some people celebrated his downfall. Walter never did. One cold evening near the end of harvest season, Clyde Mercer sat beside Walter outside the barn, watching sunset fall across the old rows of pumps. "You know," Clyde said quietly, "most men would have enjoyed proving them wrong." Walter stared towards the fading light for a long time before answering. "No," he said softly. "Most men just want somebody to understand why they stayed patient." The wind moved gently through the dry Kansas grass, and for a while neither man spoke again. Walter Boone died in the spring of 2024. A small funeral was held beneath cloudy skies outside Greystone County. Farmers arrived from 4 different states. Many drove trucks still carrying old diesel pumps Walter himself had restored years earlier. After the service, people lingered near the church parking lot, sharing stories about him. Stories about midnight repairs, about harvests saved, about machines everyone else abandoned. But the truth was, the story had never really been about pumps at all. It was about something far older, something modern people forget too easily. That strength and wisdom rarely arrive looking impressive, that quiet men are often carrying knowledge the world will not value until disaster arrives. That experience earned through hard years matters more than polished sales speeches and flashing screens. And maybe most importantly, that people should be careful mocking things they no longer understand. Even today, during dry Kansas summers, farmers still say you can hear the deep sound of old diesel pumps rolling across the fields long after sunset. Heavy, steady, unapologetic, like echoes from another America. An America built by people who repaired things instead of replacing them. And whenever those engines roar beneath the night sky, older farmers sometimes smile quietly and remember the lonely man standing beside a fence full of rusted machines while the whole county laughed at him. Because in the end, Walter Boone was never saving dead pumps. He was saving the last pieces of a forgotten kind of strength.